A man can spend 40 years building something with his hands and still watch someone try to take it apart with a phone call to a lawyer. I didn't know that yet. Not on the morning this story starts. That morning, I only knew the rain was coming in sideways off the lake. My knee was aching the way it does before a storm, and my daughter-in-law had asked me 3 times in 2 weeks when I was going to talk to someone about the cabin. My name is Walter Cobb. I'm 68 years old, and I've spent most of my life building furniture out of a workshop behind my house on the edge of Lake Kaniska, up in the northern part of Michigan, where the winters are long and the tourists only show up for about 10 good weeks a year. My hands are cracked and stained with 40 years of walnut oil and cedar dust, and I like it that way. I raised one son in this house, buried one wife in the cemetery 2 miles down the county road, and built every piece of furniture in this place myself, including the bed I still sleep in alone. I want to tell you about my son first, because none of what happened makes any sense without him. Michael is 38 years old. Good boy. Better man than I probably deserved credit for raising, considering how much of his childhood I spent out in that workshop instead of in the house with him. He's an electrician now, runs his own 2-man outfit out of Traverse City, does honest work, doesn't cut corners. He married a woman named Renee about 6 years ago. Nice enough wedding. I walked around in a rented tux that didn't fit right and smiled for the pictures because that's what a father does. Renee worked in some kind of marketing job back then, the kind where I never quite understood what she actually did all day, just that she talked about brand strategy a lot and looked at me like I'd tracked mud into a conversation whenever I brought up the shop. She wasn't cruel to me, not at first, just distant. The kind of distant where she'd hug me at holidays with her arms but not the rest of her, and change the subject fast whenever I started talking about the lake house. Because that's the thing you need to understand before anything else in this story. The cabin isn't just wood and nails to me. My father built the frame of that place in 1961 with a crew of 3 men and a mule to haul the timber. I added onto it over 30 years, room by room, dock by dock, until it turned into the 11-acre lake property it is now, sitting on some of the last undeveloped shoreline on Kaniska. Everybody around here knows what that land is worth. I've had realtors leave cards in my mailbox twice a year since 2019. I never called a single one back. Renee found out about the acreage sometime around their 3rd year of marriage. I remember exactly when, because it was the same week she started asking, real casual over dinner, whether I'd ever thought about doing something smart with the property. Setting it up so it didn't just sit there depreciating, was how she put it. Land doesn't depreciate, I told her. And she gave me this little smile like I was a sweet old man who didn't understand money. I let it go. You let a lot of things go at my age. Mostly because arguing takes energy I'd rather spend in the shop. My health started slipping about 2 years ago. Nothing dramatic at first. Some shortness of breath climbing the stairs to the loft where I keep my good lumber. A doctor in town who kept using the word cardiac in sentences I didn't like the sound of. I didn't tell Michael how bad it actually was. Not the full truth of it, because I didn't want him driving up here every weekend fussing over me like I was already gone. That was my mistake, maybe. Keeping quiet. But it's the only kind of mistake a proud man knows how to make. I had my first real scare in March. Woke up in the night with my chest feeling like somebody had set a truck tire on it, and I drove myself to the county hospital because I didn't want to wake anybody at that hour. Heart attack, they told me. Mild, but a warning shot. I called Michael from the hospital bed the next morning, and I could hear something crack in his voice when he answered, like he'd been half expecting a call like that for longer than he'd let on. He drove up that same day, 6 hours. Didn't even pack a bag first. Renee came with him. She sat in the corner of that hospital room in her good coat, checking her phone, and every time I looked over, she'd give me this soft, sympathetic face that never quite reached her eyes. "We're just so glad you're okay, Walter," she said, patting my hand once, like she was closing out a meeting. I came home from the hospital a week later to a stack of mail on my kitchen table that Michael had brought in for me, and sitting right on top of it, glossy and official looking, was a real estate appraisal packet. Not addressed to me, addressed to Renee. I don't know if she meant to leave it there, or if she just didn't think an old man paid attention to paperwork anymore, but I read every page of it standing right there in my kitchen, with my coat still on. Comparable lakefront parcels on Kaniska, selling in the $2.2 to $2.8 million range, once subdivided. I sat down at that table for a long while, long enough that my coffee went cold beside me. I thought about my father and that mule hauling timber up from the county road. I thought about Michael learning to swim off that same dock at 4 years old, screaming with joy, water going everywhere. I thought about how quiet Renee had gotten every time I talked about the property, and how that quiet wasn't peace, it was arithmetic. I didn't say anything to Michael about it. Not then. I wanted to be wrong. A man wants to be wrong about people he's supposed to love. Spring turned into that long stretch of Michigan summer where the tourists show up, and the lake gets loud with jet skis and bonfires, and I kept mostly to myself, out in the shop, working on a rocking chair I'd been promising to finish for a widow 2 towns over. Michael called most Sundays, same as always. Renee rarely got on the phone anymore. When she did, her voice had this careful, measuring quality to it, like she was talking to an appraiser instead of her father-in-law. It was a Tuesday afternoon in July when Michael showed up at the shop unannounced, dust still on his boots from a job site, looking like a man who hadn't slept right in a while. "Dad," he said, standing in the doorway with his hands jammed in his pockets. "We need to talk about the cabin." I set down my chisel. "All right. Renee thinks we think that, with your health being what it is now, it might make sense to start thinking about the property differently. Maybe get it appraised properly. Maybe even think about subdividing part of it. There's serious money out there for lakefront like this, Dad, and I know you don't need it, but she needs it," I said quietly. He flinched like I'd hit him. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" He didn't answer that, which told me plenty. "I want you to understand something about the next few weeks, because I think a lot of you watching this have lived some version of it, and it's going to sting a little to hear it laid out plain. It stung for me too, watching my own son start repeating phrases that weren't his. Words like asset allocation and long-term planning, coming out of a boy who used to fall asleep in the truck bed under a tarp during summer storms, just so he could say he slept outside. Renee started coming up to the cabin more that summer. Always with a reason. Checking on me, she'd say, bringing groceries I hadn't asked for, sitting on my porch with her laptop open, taking photographs of the shoreline, just to have them. Once I caught her walking the property line with a man in a polo shirt I didn't recognize, pointing at things, gesturing toward the water. I asked Michael about it later. "Surveyor," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Renee wanted a professional opinion, in case, in case something happens to you, and we need to know what we're working with. In case something happens to you." I went back into my shop that evening, and I sat on the stool by my workbench for a long time without picking up a single tool, because I understood, sitting there in the sawdust and the smell of cedar, that my daughter-in-law wasn't planning for my death out of grief. She was planning for it out of opportunity. And my son, God love him, exhausted from work and marriage, and maybe just wanting some peace in his own house, had stopped fighting her on it. I called my attorney the next morning, a woman named Deborah Marsh, who'd handled my late wife's estate and who I trusted about as much as I trusted anyone wearing a suit. I told her everything, the appraisal packet, the surveyor, the way Renee's voice had changed whenever the property came up. Deborah listened without saying much, the way good lawyers do, and then she asked me one question that changed the whole shape of what came next. "Walter, do you want to protect this land for Michael, or do you want to protect it from what might happen to Michael's marriage?" I sat with that question a long time before I answered her. "Both," I finally said. "I want my son to have what I built. I just don't want it to end up in somebody else's hands the second it changes ownership." Over the following month, quietly, without telling a soul, Deborah and I built something. A qualified personal residence trust, she called it, wrapped around a broader family trust structure, the kind of thing that takes lawyers years of school to understand, and takes about 4 sentences to explain to a regular man. The property would transfer, eventually, entirely to Michael, protected the whole way, shielded from any claims that might come at it sideways, through a divorce, through creditors, through anybody who married into the family, without marrying into the sweat that built it. I signed papers in Deborah's office on a Thursday in August, my hand a little unsteady, my heart doing that flutter thing it had taken to doing since March. He won't know any of this exists, I told her, until the day he needs to. That's your right, Deborah said. It's your land, Walter. I drove home that afternoon, with the windows down, the lake wind coming off the water smelling like pine and gasoline from the marina. And for the first time in months, something in my chest loosened that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I want to be honest with you about what came next, because I think it's the part of this story people need to hear most. I didn't die. Not then. This isn't a story about a will being read over a casket. Not the way you might expect. What happened instead was smaller, and in some ways worse, and it happened in my own kitchen on a rainy Sunday afternoon in September. Michael and Renee came up for what was supposed to be a quiet dinner. Pot roast, the way I used to make it for his mother. Renee brought a bottle of wine that probably cost more than the whole meal, set it down on my counter without a word, and by the second glass she'd started in on what I now understood was the real reason for the visit. Walter, she said, that same soft, measuring voice. Michael and I have been talking, and we really think it's time to formalize some things. With your health the way it's been, we'd hate for anything to be complicated later. Complicated how? I asked, though I already knew. Well, legally. If something happened to you without clear documentation, the estate could end up tied up in probate for years. We just want to protect what's yours. What will be Michael's? Notice how she said that. What will be Michael's? Like she'd already rehearsed the sentence in a mirror. I've got a lawyer, I said. Things are documented. Something flickered across her face, quick, gone before Michael could have caught it. But I caught it. Surprise. Maybe even a flash of alarm. Oh, she said. Well, that's good. Who's handling it? Maybe our attorney could review the language, just to make sure everything's structured efficiently. Efficiently, I repeated. Tax-wise. Liability-wise. You know how these things can get messy. I set my fork down. Renee, I've been putting things together in a way I trust. I'd rather not have outside lawyers picking through my affairs. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, the way a rope pulls taut right before it snaps. I'm not outside, Walter. I'm family. I looked at my son. He was staring at his plate, pushing pot roast around like a boy, hoping the conversation would end if he just stayed quiet enough. That, more than anything Renee said that night, was what broke something loose in my chest. Not her ambition, his silence. Michael, I said, you got something to say? He looked up, and for a second I saw the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck bed, still in there somewhere, buried under 6 years of somebody else's arithmetic. Dad, we just want to make sure everything's handled right. That's all this is. Everything is handled right, I said, quiet, final. It's handled the way I want it handled. That's the whole point of it being mine to handle. Renee's face went cold in a way I hadn't seen before. Not fully, not until that exact moment. The mask of concerned daughter-in-law slipping just enough that I saw what was underneath. You're going to leave your only son wondering what he's inheriting? After everything? After we drove up here every time you had a health scare? Every time, I said slowly. You brought a surveyor with you. Silence. Real silence. The kind where you can hear the rain against the windows and your own pulse in your ears. That's not fair, she said, but her voice had lost its footing. I think it's exactly fair, I said. I think you've been measuring this property since the week you found out what it was worth, and I think you've been measuring me right alongside it, waiting to see how much time you had left to wait. She stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. I don't have to sit here and be insulted in my own. She stopped herself. Caught the word before it came out, but I heard the shape of it forming anyway. In my own house. She'd nearly called my house hers. I think you two should head home, I said. Roads get bad in the rain out here. Michael didn't argue. He gathered up the dishes without meeting my eyes, and Renee stood by the door with her arms crossed, staring out at the dark lake like it owed her something. They left without finishing the meal. I sat alone at that kitchen table for a long time afterward, listening to the rain, thinking about my father and his mule, and the 3 men who'd raised those first walls 60-some years ago, and I thought, not for the first time, that some kinds of love get built the same way that cabin was built. Slow, deliberate, board by board, meant to last. And some kinds of love are just surveys, waiting on a number. I didn't hear from either of them for almost 3 weeks after that dinner. Michael sent one short text, "Sorry about Sunday, Dad. Love you," and nothing else. I let the silence sit. Some silences need sitting with. Then, on a Thursday in October, my phone rang, and it was Michael's number, but it wasn't Michael's voice that answered when I picked up. It was a woman I didn't recognize, brisk and professional, identifying herself as calling from the law office of Hargrove and Neal. "Mr. Cobb, I'm calling on behalf of my client, Renee Cobb, regarding the marital dissolution proceedings currently underway between her and Michael Cobb, and I wanted to ask you a few questions regarding the disposition of the lake property, given its relevance to the marital estate." I sat down slow in my chair by the window, looking out over the water, and I felt something in me go very still and very clear, the way it does right before a storm finally breaks, instead of just threatening to. "Dissolution," I said. "You mean divorce?" "That's correct, sir." "Does my son know you're calling me?" A pause. "I couldn't speak to that, Mr. Cobb." I hung up the phone without another word and called Michael myself. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear something raw and exhausted in his voice the second he said hello. "She filed," he said, before I could even ask. 3 days ago." "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have called you myself. I didn't know how to say it." "Why now?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a hollowed-out quality I hadn't heard since his mother's funeral. "She found out about the trust. Somehow. I don't even know how. She came home from work one day and said her attorney had done some digging, found out you'd restructured your assets back in August, and Dad, she said, if I wasn't going to make you do the right thing about the property, then she wanted her fair share out of the marriage instead. Said 4 years of marriage entitled her to half of whatever comes to me eventually. She's trying to get the court to treat the future inheritance as a marital asset. Her lawyers arguing anticipated inheritance should count toward equitable division." I sat with that for a long moment, watching the wind move across the lake, gray and restless under a sky the color of wet slate. "She can try," I finally said. "Dad, Michael, listen to me. I need you to hear this clean. No arguing, no defending her. Not this time. That land isn't yours yet. It's mine. It sits in a trust I built with my own lawyer, structured specifically so no one, not her attorney, not a judge in a courtroom 200 miles from here, can touch it based on a marriage that's ending before the transfer even happens. You understand what I'm telling you?" Silence on the line. Then, quiet. "You did this back in August, before the dinner." "I did it in August," I confirmed. "Before I ever knew for certain what she was. I just knew what I was afraid she might be." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you loved her," I said. "And I didn't want to be the reason you doubted that. Not unless doubting it was going to save you something. Looks like it's about to." He didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear him breathing on the other end, ragged, and I understood that somewhere in that silence, 38 years of loyalty to a woman who'd measured his father's shoreline before she'd measured her own, marriage was finally cracking open. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said eventually. "I should have seen it sooner. I think some part of me did see it and just didn't want to." "I know the feeling," I said. "I built a whole cabin with a man I never once heard raise his voice, and I still didn't see everything coming either. Doesn't make you weak, son. Just makes you somebody who wanted to believe the best about a person you chose." The hearing got scheduled for the second week of November, in a courthouse, 2 counties south, brick and gray columned. The kind of building that's seen more marriages end than it ever saw begin. I drove down myself, 6 hours, my old truck rattling the whole way, because I wasn't about to let my son walk into that room without his father sitting somewhere in the gallery behind him, whether Renee's lawyers liked it or not. The courtroom smelled like old wood polish and coffee. Renee sat at one table in a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than my truck, her attorney beside her, a sharp young man named Preston Hargrove who kept glancing at his watch like he had somewhere better to be. Michael sat alone at the other table. No lawyer beside him yet. Just a manila folder Deborah Marsh had prepared for him. And when he turned and saw me settle into the gallery behind him, something in his shoulders eased just slightly. Renee's attorney stood first, laid out his argument smooth as a sales pitch. 4 years of marriage. Significant contributions to the household. A reasonable expectation, given the known existence of a substantial family estate, that a portion of anticipated inheritance ought to factor into equitable distribution, particularly given testimony regarding conversations about the property's future value. He was, I realized, listening to him, building a whole legal argument out of Renee's own greed, dressing up her spreadsheet math in courtroom language, and hoping nobody would notice the seams. Deborah stood when it was her turn, calm as still water, the way good lawyers always seem to be right before they take somebody's whole argument apart. Your Honor, opposing counsel is asking this court to treat a discretionary, irrevocable trust established by a third party, my client's father, months before these dissolution proceedings began, for the explicit and documented purpose of protecting family property from exactly this kind of claim as a marital asset belonging to a marriage that trust was never part of. Mr. Cobb the Elder is the trust's grantor. My client, Michael Cobb, is a beneficiary with no present ownership interest, no control over distribution, and no legal claim to the property until conditions specified entirely by his father are met. There is nothing here to divide, because there is nothing here that belongs to this marriage at all. Preston Hargrove tried to argue timing, tried to suggest the trust's creation so close to the marital difficulties implied bad faith, an attempt to shield assets in anticipation of divorce. Deborah calmly produced the paperwork. August 4th, the trust was signed. The first documented conversation about divorce, according to Renee's own attorney's filing, happened in late September. The math didn't work in their favor, and everybody in that courtroom could see it land. The judge, an older woman with reading glasses pushed low on her nose, took her time flipping through the trust documents Deborah had provided. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, unhurried, final. The court finds the property in question to be held in an irrevocable trust, established independently by a non-party to this marriage, for purposes clearly documented and predating any filed dissolution action. As such, the trust corpus is not subject to equitable distribution in these proceedings. The court further notes, for the record, that any future distributions from said trust, contingent as they are on conditions set solely by the grantor, remain outside the marital estate. Renee's face didn't crumble the way I might have expected. It went white, then rigid, like she was holding something together through sheer force of will. Preston Hargrove closed his folder slowly, the kind of slow that told me he already knew what came next in his own accounting, a client with far less to offer him than he'd been promised. The hearing wrapped with the ordinary business of divorce court, the house they'd bought together to be sold and split, the joint accounts divided, nothing dramatic, nothing that made for a good story, except the one piece that mattered most, had already been decided. Cleanly, months before anyone in that room but me and Deborah Marsh had even known to look for it. Outside on the courthouse steps, the November air sharp and cold off the parking lot, Renee caught up to us before we reached the truck. She'd taken off the composed courtroom face somewhere between the doors and the parking lot, and what was underneath it wasn't pretty. "You did this on purpose," she said, looking at me, not Michael. "You knew. You've known this whole time." "I knew what kind of man my father was," I said. "I built a life trying to be the same kind of man for my son. That's all that happened here." 4 years, she said, her voice cracking. 4 years of holidays and hospital visits and pretending I cared about your ridiculous cabin, and this is what I get? "You cared about the shoreline," I said quietly. "I watched you walk it with a surveyor, before you ever once asked me how I was really doing after that heart attack." She didn't have an answer for that. Just stood there, in the cold, with her charcoal suit and her expensive attorney, already checking his phone by the car. And for a moment, I almost felt something like pity for her. Almost. Then I remembered the appraisal packet on my kitchen table, and the pity passed on through me like weather. "Michael," she said, turning to my son, softer now, reaching for something that might have once worked on him. We had something real. Doesn't that count for anything? Michael looked at her for a long moment. I watched 38 years of my son settle into his face all at once, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady in a way that made something in my chest swell up with a pride I hadn't earned but was grateful for anyway. I think you love the idea of what my dad's land could become, he said. I don't think you ever once loved the man who built it, or the man who was going to inherit it. I just didn't want to admit that until a judge said it out loud for me. We drove back north together that afternoon, Michael following me in his own truck for a stretch of the highway before peeling off toward Traverse City, and I stopped at a diner along the way, the kind with a pie case by the register and a waitress who's called me Han since before my wife passed. I sat in a booth by the window and ordered a coffee I didn't really want, mostly just to have something to hold on to while I let the last of the day settle. My father used to say that a man builds two things in his life that actually matter: what he leaves behind and who he leaves it to. I'd spent 40 years thinking the answer to the first part was the cabin. Standing in that courtroom, watching my son find his spine at 38 years old, in front of a woman who'd spent 6 years measuring him against a shoreline, I understood the second part finally mattered a whole lot more. Michael came up to the cabin the following weekend, alone for the first time in years, and we sat out on the dock his mother used to love, watching the last of the leaves come down gold and red across the water. He didn't say much. Didn't need to. We just sat there, two men who'd both learned something hard about love and money in the same autumn, watching the lake do what it's always done, patient and unbothered by anybody's arithmetic. "I'm sorry I let it get that far, Dad," he finally said. "You didn't let anything happen," I told him. "You loved somebody. That's not a crime. It's just a risk, same as building on a shoreline that floods sometimes. You do it anyway, because the alternative is never building anything at all." He laughed, quiet, the first real laugh I'd heard out of him in months. "You're going to put that on a plaque or something?" "Already got a plaque," I said. "Says Cobb family, 1961. Figured that one covers it." The divorce finalized in January. Renee moved out of state not long after, back to wherever her people were from originally, chasing some new marketing job in a city with better restaurants and no lakefront property attached to the man she married there. If there ever is a next one. I don't wish her ill, not really. I just don't think about her much at all anymore, which I suppose is its own kind of ending. The trust transfers to Michael in full 8 years from now, on schedule, exactly the way Deborah and I structured it, protected the whole way through by conditions only I ever had the right to set. Until then, I'm still out here, most mornings in the shop, hands in the sawdust, finishing that rocking chair for the widow 2 towns over, listening to the lake wake up outside my window, the same way it has for 68 years. I didn't leave my son a fortune he could touch the day I'm gone. I left him something a whole lot harder to take away from him. A father who paid attention, and a piece of ground that only ever belonged to people willing to build something real on it, one board at a time.